that works. Preston, how's it holding?
Looks good to me.
Harry Haft. I'm a journalist. I covered your fight. I'm interested in your story.
Everybody knows my story. I'm the survivor of Auschwitz.
We fight until one man can no longer get up.
Put them up! Hands up! Hands up!
My girl from back home, she doesn't know that I'm alive. But if my name is in the papers, I want to fight Marciano.
I will plaster your story all over the East Coast.
Well, Mr. Foster, it's a great honor to meet you. I've been I know I'm probably not supposed to say this, but I'm a longtime fan of your work, and your performance here is just absolutely incredible. So I hope you're proud of it and the powerful story that you carry with it, because you should be.
Appreciate that, Preston. Thank you.
Yeah. So what struck me right away is how you fill the air with so much meaning and feeling, even when you're not saying anything. The very first scene on the beach, which is later in Herzog's life, we haven't seen any of his story yet, but those years of pain and strength can be felt in those early moments with your stillness and the way that you take in your surroundings. This is a quality I've always recognized in your work, whether it's what you did with Oren Moverman, Mangold, Dave McKenzie. Can you recall when your interests in that kind of a performance and that storytelling may have taken a hold of you?
The first thought that comes to mind, Preston, is as a young person, a kid, I had terrible hearing issues. Runs in the family. Some people got surgery. You know, you got to get the tubes put in. My parents chose not to do that surgery, and it wasn't fully recognized as a youngster. And only after probably the age of 3 or 4 did my parents recognize how bad the issue was. So much of my earlier days were muffled. So I suppose when one sense is limited, maybe others are compensate. So having to read people, not read lips so much, but behavior. That's the first thought that comes to mind. But also, so much of who we are as people is between the words. You know, we tell people what we want them to think of us, but who we really are is in between the words. And I'm drawn to those behavioral elements in all human beings, and particularly my trade as an actor. That's kind of the bread and butter. It's who are they really inside?
Yeah, for sure. I'm not sure how much you had shot before you did that scene, but did you get to pull from a lot of experience and memory, as in like the scenes that you shot, rather than what you read on the page, because it feels more genuine that way?
Yes, we did, and thank goodness for that. It's unusual for most films to shoot in order or relatively in order. Unfortunately, we were able to shoot relatively from the beginning to the end. So we started filming in the camps. We then took 5 weeks off, so I dropped 62 pounds for the camps. We shot all those sequence out, the fights, etc., the escape, the death march. And then we took 5 weeks off so I could build back up.
Yeah.
And gain 50 pounds for Harry's attempts to continue a languishing boxing career in New York. And then following that period of time, the sequence that you're referring to, when Harry is reflecting on his past, I had several weeks to just eat and meditate on the experiences that we had filmed already. So by that point, it was already in my body, and it's, I suppose,
Right.
easier to reflect upon rather than articulate.
Gotcha. So how different do you think it would have been if you started the other way around?
Well, it would have been far less convenient.
Sure.
You know, yeah, I think we're all looking to do the work and make it count. To my personal experience, it's easier to gain weight than to lose it.
Mm.
Yeah, I'd say the way we shot it, I'm very appreciative to the production. I think it helps the entire film crew. It helps the director. Not like Barry needs hand-holding, but
Right.
to quote him, filmmaking is a learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
You don't go in knowing the exact film you're gonna do, or at least his approach is far more a living thing than a prescriptive blueprint. And that's the joy. One of the joys of working with him is that every day feels very alive and full of potential for some exploration.
Sure. Yeah. Did you and Barry have a lot of conversations about subtlety in preparation of this? Because I think that's like the big takeaway for me from watching this, is that, like you were talking about earlier, about like there's so much that can be observed in between the lines. And I think even Peter Skarsgård's character has that really great part where he's talking about, the sweet spot and the cracks and the common ground between good and evil. And then there's the following scene right after that with Billy Magnuson that perfectly illustrates that. And it's just, there's so much to take away from a moment like that. That was a moment, in addition to the ending, where you're like, that's the movie, like that's what it's about. And I wonder like what was kind of going through your head when it came to moments like that have so much to think about, that can just send me to have so many conversations with my wife and my son and things like that.
I appreciate that you appreciate the stillness. It's not something that I suppose is in vogue these days in cinema, in film. We like a lot of fast editing. We like a lot of zoom slam cuts and handheld and pseudo documentary stuff. I mean, it's kind of what a lot of independent film has been reduced to. But that's not the film we were making. A word that Barry likes to use is credible. Does it feel credible?
Mm-hmm.
And in our preparation, I spent a great deal of time listening and watching other survivors' testimonies. And though the testimonies are of survivors who are of a certain age, we're not watching recent footage of survivors as young people. But Barry shaped me as a younger actor. He gave me my first real film in Liberty Heights.
Yeah.
And he's interested in those moments, and they're not scripted always. He's interested in the offbeat. He's interested in a moment of improv. He's interested in taking the wheels off a scene or creating an incident. As example, there's a moment Harry speaking to his later in life to his wife Miriam in the kitchen, and as written, it was, she says, "You have to tell them about your experience." We're talking about my son is about to be bar mitzvah, and they say, "I can't. You can't do that. You can't push that kind of evil into a child." To which she responds, "You already are."
Yeah.
I believe it's scripted. It was Harry then turns his back on his wife and says, "Nothing. And she says, well, what is it? What aren't you telling me? And he says, the worst part of me. She's then supposed to get up and give Harry a hug and soothe his wound of being unable to articulate it. But Barry, unbeknownst to me, told Vicky, who plays Miriam, Vicky Creeps, wonderful, sublime actor.
Yeah.
Out of my earshot, let's see what happens if you don't give Ben a hug. And she said, well, should we tell him? And he said, no. So we do the scene, and I say, you don't know the worst part of me. And instead of not giving me a hug, which I'm waiting for, she starts antagonizing Harry. She starts asking harder questions and more difficult questions. And that provoked me, because we had already shot an order, to tell the worst story. This wasn't scripted, this wasn't planned, but it was about killing my friend Jean in the camps. So what's in the film is a memory of a scene we had already shot. And it became so emotionally charged, and she kept going at me like any good actor or musician who's jamming. It provoked a feeling of deep unrest, and it resulted in me hitting a pitcher of orange juice across the set. None of this was planned, but these are the moments that land in the film that are the seeds that Barry planted very early on and throughout, and not necessarily with our knowledge of it. So I think those are the moments that truly enrich the film is do your preparation and listen to each other.
Speaking of that moment, where would because that's another thing, like the reveals of the parallel editing here is really great, because that feeds into the subtlety of not being able to just having a story and like sharing it, like, hey, this is what happened. He'll cut to the past, and it's very like just like memory works, and it feels organic, it feels honest. And so would the reveal have been different if you had not told that story right in that moment of that particular story of the footage that you shot?
Well, that's the beauty of editing. You can tee off anything, and particularly this film, as Barry said from the beginning, he said, I want it to feel jagged. As an editorial cut, one could imagine Harry turns his back on his wife and says, you don't know the worst part of me. Gets a hug. We have a close-up on Harry. We see his eyes drifting into the light, and we're back and we're watching the memory rather than it being a shared one verbally. So, I mean, however you want to, you can cut a, this absolutely cracks me up. It's really silly. There's a thing called, it's the preview for The Shining as a satire, and they recut it as a romantic family comedy. Yeah. So to me, I watch that and I'm just like, that's exactly the craft of the editor, and what's the score and how do you do it? Shining, it's right. You can kind of do anything with that. But Barry does create circumstances that demands that everybody's listening to each other, because there might be a surprise moment that happens. Sometimes it works, sometimes it does not. Sure.
Yeah. I know we're about out of time, but I'll cut you loose on asking about plugging into a lot of the lessons that are within this film. Speaking of that exact moment of being able to share some of that darkness with your son, in the case of this film, that's something that I think about. There's a lot of things that are going on in the world today. I have a almost 5-year-old, turns 5 in August, and I have to be able to share some of these things. And it's a movie like this that kind of gets me thinking about, what should I shield them from? What should I have them experience? And I'm curious if a movie like that has a power to really shift your thinking a little bit about how you may approach fatherhood, or some of the big life lessons that audiences may be taken away from this.
I hope so. I too have our daughter turns 5 at the end of July. My wife and I ask these questions of each other every day, and And I suppose, just being a human being, we all have traumas.
Yeah.
I'm not comparing it to the camps, but every human being, you live long enough, you're going to experience things that one has not fully looked at and had a catharsis with and confronted. But within that, as an adult, we must find new ways of communicating. It's the how rather than the what. And I suppose that's what Harry has not confronted and must, hopefully, to some point by the end of the film.